Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to finally be here after hearing so much about this fantastic facility and talking with Zoltan over the years. My name is Brian. I come from Orbital Studios in Los Angeles, California. We are a virtual production company that is based in downtown. We have a nice studio with multiple stages, multiple LED walls, one that looks very similar to this. And so we obviously do a lot of production, but we do more than that. We kind of think of ourselves as an education company first and foremost, which is not the sexiest way to describe this, but it's because we're dealing with new technology. So much of what we do on a daily basis is educating people on how to use the technology, how to incorporate it into their workflows, as we've heard from previous speakers, how that's important. We also develop and produce our own content. One of the things that's unique about our operation is that we are a mobile service provider. And the reason why we kind of entered into that space is partly due to my background. I've worked for the past 15 plus years for international sales companies in business and legal affairs. Again, another sexy sounding descriptor. But essentially what I learned in those experiences working for those companies is how to package projects, primarily independent film. What are the different building blocks that are required and that buyers are looking for? Essentially all in an effort to answer the question of how are you going to make this thing that you're talking about? And so understanding how those different components play a part in that overall structure has been key. So when Orbital began about 5 years ago, we did so with very specific directives. One was we needed to be flexible. We needed to have the ability to go where production is happening. And even before everything that's gone on the last couple of years with COVID, with industry strikes, with wildfires, productions were moving away from California many, many years ago. You started hearing about productions popping up in Atlanta, Georgia, New Mexico, places where tax incentives were, shall we say, a little bit friendlier. And certainly that applies to places in Europe, including and especially Budapest. So when we set up our operations, everything that we were doing was really cool. It looked great, but we had to have the flexibility to meet people where they are, because it's unrealistic to think that you're going to be moving an entire production of 100 plus people to a volume stage for a part of your shoot. We needed to be able to go there. That proved to be a significant game changer, and the flexibility and accessibility of that has helped filmmakers and producers alike very, very much so. I want to pause in a little bit, or I want to pause right now just to show you our reel, because that, I think, will show you a variety of the different kinds of things that we are doing both at our stages in Orbital and also on location. And then I'll kind of come back to it and talk a little bit more about that in depth. love that stuff. So there's a lot going on in there, which I won't spend too much time going into all the particulars, but essentially it's just to give you an idea of the variety of different kinds of things that these tools, as we've been hearing about all day, you know, the tools in the toolbox, what they can do. You saw music videos, commercials, a lot of behind the scenes stuff, obviously film and television. Most of that was shot in our studio in Los Angeles, but a fair amount of that was actually shot on location. And you saw a lot of car work in there, which is an obvious understanding of the technology and the easiest way to understand how it works as opposed to a practical solution. You also saw a lot of what we call kind of out the window, you know, creating LED environments outside of, you know, high rises and things of that nature. So with what we do, and I think the net effect of virtual production and how it's most easily understood is really, it distills down to collaboration, which I know is kind of like a big, you know, buzzword when we talk about making movies, but it's really true. We don't think of ourselves, and nor do we want people that we work with to think of us or virtual production as a vendor. We want people to understand that virtual production and the people involved in that space are really more partners than you realize. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, it means that you don't want to start thinking about virtual production when you're 30 days out from starting your shoot, because at that point in the process, virtual production, whether you'll admit it or not, is really more of a backup plan than anything else. Virtual production can be a primary solution, and just to be clear, very few instances exist where you would use shooting in a volume for the entirety of your project. In fact, we oftentimes will tell clients, you may actually want to shoot this part on location. You may want to shoot some second unit stuff over here. Because as with everything with the technology, there's always a balance. It's always a collaboration and a marriage between what you're seeing on the digital side of it versus the practical. And just to be also very clear, because we're dealing in new technology, and you know, we could talk about AI as well, this is not a situation where robots are coming to take over and people are going to be out of a job because of this technology. This is simply meant, and we've heard this already before, it's an enhancement for what people are already doing. Yes, you still need those skilled and trained cinematographers and production managers and art directors. This is not impacting their lives at all. This is actually going to make their jobs a lot easier and more dynamic. It's going to force them to think of it in a different way. So it's always a marriage of kind of the practical, the foreground elements, and what's happening in a digital landscape. And if we're doing our jobs correctly, then everything you just saw in the reel, you won't be able to tell what is real and what's not. You know, that's the seamless effect that we try to bring to every project, whether it's a music video or a full feature film. So part of that is understanding, you know, how to change kind of the thinking behind production pipelines and production workflows. And again, this has been alluded to a number of times, and there's a reason why we keep sort of saying the same things about this, which is you have to start thinking about these tools well earlier in the process than you normally would. I don't know how many directors we have in the room, but it's very common of directors and even cinematographers to kind of throw their hands up and say, I don't know what I want until I see it. Let me just see everything and then I'll know what I want here. And with virtual production, it doesn't quite work that way. It could, but to be more efficient, both with your time and your money, it helps to have those conversations early to start to kind of pinpoint and zero in on what are the looks, what are the shots that you're trying to get, because it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all and, more importantly, a one-price-fits-all. It's really about customizing and utilizing the tools to fit your project. We at Orbital, and I'm sure a lot of places, we're not in the business of showing you how cool our stuff is. We're in the business of using what we have to help you make your project look 10 times better than you ever thought possible. The only way that we achieve that is by having discussions as early as possible about what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so I think that's something very important to understand as filmmakers, as storytellers, is that we get asked this a lot. When's the right time to start talking to you guys? Right now, as soon as you can. The most effective examples of works that we've been involved with on the TV and film side are ones in which we are talking to the filmmakers, the producers, the decision makers, the department heads months in advance. When they are kind of in those nascent stages, like many of you probably are with your projects, where you're like, how am I going to do this? Where am I going to do this? How much time do I have? How much money do I have? How do I kind of fit it all into that box? I think another easy way to understand how this technology can have a direct impact on what you're doing and to understand how accessible it is, that it's not just for Star Wars and for Marvel, but it's actually for independent projects, things that you think, well, I can never afford this. Well, let's unpack that a little bit. Part of the saving time and the saving money goes into your planning. And if you think about a traditional budget of a television show, a commercial, even a film, the three areas that virtual production has the most immediate and direct impact in are visual effects, post-production, and locations. And while VP does not eliminate either or any of those three categories, when used correctly and enough, they can significantly reduce those. So unlike tax incentives, for instance, where you submit your script and your budget and your vision to a country or a state, and they say, great, we have a 30% tax incentive, your budget's 10 million, here's a piece of paper that says you're gonna get back 3 million from our state or country. Well, you can take that piece of paper to a bank or a lending institution, they can front you that money, and that becomes part of your finance plan. Unfortunately, virtual production isn't quite as seamless as that, but it does work in a very similar way. It's a bit of a pencil sharpening exercise where you have to kind of go in and figure out, okay, if you've allocated X because you've got 20 different locations, but now half of those locations are coming into a volume. All right, well, that's gonna save you a little bit of money there because you're not having to do all these big company moves, and you're just reducing the number of days as well that you're gonna be shooting those 10 environments. So that's a cost savings as well, which means you're saving money on the crew that you need for that. So it's incremental. It starts to reveal itself in small ways, but in the aggregate, that's where the saving time and the saving money really starts to show itself. It's never just I guarantee I'll save you 20% on whatever your budget is by using VP. You really have to kind of get your hands dirty to understand where those savings exist. I think another important thing to understand is, like anything else, you have to know who your audience is when you talk about virtual production. When you talk to directors and cinematographers, that's the cool stuff. They want to see how it looks. They want to see the fidelity. They want to know if it's a 15K resolution coming back at you. When you're talking to a UPM or a line producer, they don't care as much about that. They care about how much it costs, and producers are kind of somewhere in the middle. So you have to be able to speak to these different pillars in a very direct way so that people understand where the advantages are, where the benefits are. Because the longer you kind of let that go without speaking directly to those things, the easier and easier it becomes for clients to kind of revert back to green screen, or revert back to kind of the traditional ways of filmmaking that aren't using this technology to its fullest effect. And what happens then? Well, they end up spending more time, they end up spending more money because it's something they're familiar with. So that oftentimes is kind of the biggest pain point of all of this, is just kind of getting people over that hump creatively, logistically, theoretically, about what this can and cannot do. One of the kind of tenets of our starting Orbital when we did was we're movie fans like anybody else. We're not a bunch of tech bros, and I use that term lovingly. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because our team are, they're experienced gaffers, grips, DPs, directors, people that have spent thousands of hours on film and television sets. And it sounds kind of simplistic to put it like that, but it's also important. There have been several examples of big name shows with big companies that are using virtual production with a bunch of tech bros, with people that are not as experienced in filmmaking. So when the director says, hey, can you bring that down a stop? They don't know what they're talking about. And that is critical. It sounds like it's not that big of a deal, but if we've ever been on set, you know how important 5 minutes is, right? So our job, and if we're doing our job well, is to never be the reason that things slow down, to never be the reason that people have to Google what a term is. It's always about speaking the language to filmmakers, and that's critical. And one of the things that we had learned kind of in the beginning, which I'm sure a lot of you experienced as well, you're looking at the examples of shows like The Mandalorian and Lion King and Star Trek, you're seeing the finished product. What we were hearing about, especially within the industry, and you get this with any new technology, I guarantee you'll hear this next week when iPhone comes out with the iPhone 17, is that 5% of the population is going to talk about how cool it is, and 95% is going to talk about what's not cool about it, what it doesn't do, or what it doesn't do as well as this. So when virtual production kind of was on the scene and studio heads were talking about it, all they were talking about was what it doesn't do, what it doesn't allow you to do, all of the trap doors, all of the negativity. And we looked at that, and we kind of took one issue at a time and said, I understand why people are saying this is where a fault is, but all of these problems, that people say virtual production can't accomplish, these are all fixable problems. They're fixable in a way, in a couple different ways. One, taking the time to educate yourself on what the problem is and then to provide that remedy. Certainly, the technology itself is ever evolving. I know we've heard a lot about Unreal Engine today. We use Unreal Engine, the latest version with all of our operations. But as anybody that's ever worked with Unreal knows, every iteration of the software solves another problem that the previous one really couldn't. A couple of years ago, we couldn't do real-time water, using Unreal Engine. We couldn't do crowd work using Unreal Engine. Now, we're much further along with it. So rather than having to use different plugins and essentially kind of MacGyver a solution together, the technology is catching up. The LEDs itself, that is pretty stable. These are phenomenal panels that we have with a 2.8 pixel pitch. Do they make lower pixel pitches? Sure, but what's the advantage of that? What are you trying to get to here? This achieves what you want to do with a visual look just as well as anything else. So a lot of questions that we often get asked is, well, what are you going to do in a year when they come up with a better panel? Well, better how? The panels that we have, the panels that you use here, they work for the entire ecosystem that you've set up. And I think as evidenced by the setup here is you want to work with best-in-class partners. Everybody that's talked already today, myself included, we don't do all of this on our own. We have strategic relationships. We work with different vendors, different camera providers, different lighting providers, okay? Because it's a collaboration, full stop, in every sense. And so working with different people to achieve different things is the only way in which this technology is going to become more ubiquitous, more widely used in the industry. And I'll just close by just saying, one of the things that we have really benefited from in our short lifespan as a virtual production company is really understanding how filmmakers such as yourselves are making content all over the world. We kind of live in this little bubble called Hollywood here, and there's a certain way in which content is created and developed and made and sold and distributed over there. One of the advantages I think that we have by having a little bit more of a worldly exposure to this technology in the industry at large by coming to events like this is really understanding that not everybody does things the way that Hollywood does it, and that's not a bad thing. There are really dynamic, phenomenal storytellers that are telling incredible stories all over the world and using technology in ways that we never even thought possible. So as you're continuing to kind of learn and iterate and kind of wrap your head around all of this stuff that we've been talking about, and I'm sure a lot of stuff we haven't even mentioned, it's important to understand that there is no one way to do any of this. These are tools in a toolbox like we've talked about, but these are tools designed to help. And don't be afraid of it at all. And working with companies such as United Illusion, such as Orbital, such as all the people right here, we are experts in this field. So use our expertise, use our knowledge. We will guide you through the process because we don't expect that people that come into our studio or this studio know everything that there is to know about virtual production or the technology. That's the whole point. We're here to teach you. We're here to educate you. We're here to train you. That's as important as anything else that you see on an LED wall. Thanks.